Hello and welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm John Bachman, and with us now from Washington, D.C. is Congressman Tom Price of Georgia. Congressman, thanks for taking the time to talk to us.
Hey, John, thanks so much. Good to be with you all.
Well, I know you're a doctor by trade, not a lawyer, but you've been in the Supreme Court this morning. You've been listening to the hearing going on, and the big question this morning is whether or not it's premature for the Supreme Court to hear this case. Of course, we're talking about whether this will be considered a tax or a penalty if folks do not get health care. What did you interpret from the Supreme Court hearing this morning?
Well, a very exciting day, John. Historic day in our nation's history, as 2 years ago the American people came to Washington to petition their government, and in spite of their wishes, the executive branch and the legislative branch forced this law through. So right now we're working on the checks and balances portion of our Constitution and have the court listen to whether or not this ought to be a law of the land. Today, as you mentioned, was the argument as to whether or not this is a tax or a penalty, and whether or not somebody needed to be taxed prior to the court hearing the case. My sense was, it was really exciting, in the court, 8 of the 9 justices engaged very, very vigorously, and the court was packed. There was a lot of enthusiasm within the courtroom itself. But my sense was that the justices were hinting that they believe that it ought to go through, that there ought to be a decision made by this court in this sitting, as opposed to pushing it off for a longer period of time.
And how important do you think that will be, that we're hearing that there might be a decision by June. How important do you think that is before this next election coming up in November?
Well, I wouldn't put it in the context of the election. I would put it in the context of the law itself. This law is bad on all sorts of counts. As a physician, I can tell you that it harms access, it increases the cost of health care. I believe it harms the quality of health care and certainly decreases choices for the American people. So regardless of when an election is, what we need to do is make certain that this is either overturned or repealed, and then get onto the business of putting in place positive, patient-centered solutions to the challenges in health care that we face. It is so important that we make certain that this law, which is violative of access or quality or costs or choices in health care, needs to be either ruled unconstitutional, which I believe it to be, or overturned and repealed, and then get to the work of putting in place the positive, patient-centered solutions, because the status quo in health care is unacceptable as well. And we've got solutions, they're wonderful, and they'll make certain that we move in a direction that allows patients to be in charge of health care, not bureaucrats.
Well, I've heard some opponents of this law express fears that if this is upheld, if the Affordable Care Act is upheld, then that would essentially give Congress and the federal government permission to do anything. Is that your concern?
Well, it is my concern. The fact of the matter is, this is the first time in the history of our nation that the federal government has said to each and every American citizen, by virtue of being a citizen, you must buy a product, and this is what it must be. And it's that second clause, it's the "and this is what it must be," very specifically, that I think gets them into constitutional challenges. The bill is very specific in what kind of health coverage you must have. Every single American must have. And if you don't purchase what the government mandates that you purchase, then guess who enforces it? The IRS. That is just an affront to the American people.
All right, very good. Of course, tomorrow is going to be a big day when the justices will take up the issue of the individual mandate. Now, if they determine that the individual mandate is unconstitutional, but they allow other portions of the law, what will that say to you? And do you think you'll still work as aggressively to repeal the law in its whole, in its entirety?
Great question. There really are 3 options that the court can have. They can rule it constitutional, the whole thing unconstitutional, or just the individual mandate unconstitutional. If they do that, if they just rule the individual mandate unconstitutional, it still leaves in place all sorts of awful apparatus within the federal government that, again, I believe violates the access to health care, quality health care, choices in health care, and certainly the cost of health care. If the individual mandate is not allowed to stand constitutionally, which I believe is the appropriate decision, but the rest of the bill is in place, then all of the bad things like community rating and guaranteed issue and those things that drive up the cost of health care for everybody, that only work if you think they work with the individual mandate, all those would be left in place. In addition, all of the dictates to the state that are breaking states' budgets by expanding the roles of Medicaid and shoving people into the Medicaid system who ought to be able to be served in a much different way that allows them to pick the coverage that they want.
All right, very good. Now you got a busy day ahead of you, Congressman. Thanks so much for talking to us. Congressman Tom Price of Georgia.
Thanks, John, so much.